January 19th, 1915. 8:25 p.m. Great Yarmouth, England. The fishermen along the Norfolk coast heard it first. A low, droning hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They looked up into the winter darkness and saw nothing but stars. Then the searchlights clicked on, their beams sweeping across the black sky, and there it was, a cigar-shaped shadow blotting out the constellations, 650 feet long, silent as a phantom, magnificent and terrible. The German naval airship L3, commanded by Kapitän-Leutnant Hans Fritz, circled over the seaside town like a predatory whale in an ocean of air. At 9 p.m, the first bomb fell, then another, and another. 7 high explosive bombs and incendiary devices rained down on Great Yarmouth and the neighbouring town of King's Lynn. When the smoke cleared, 4 civilians lay dead and 16 wounded. The damage was minimal, barely 7,740 in total, but the psychological impact was profound. For the first time in 1,000 years, Britain's island fortress had been violated from the sky. The English Channel, that historic moat that had protected England from continental invasion since 1066, had been rendered obsolete in a single night. The age of strategic bombing had arrived, and the German military high command believed they had unleashed a weapon against which there was no defence. They called them Luftschiffe, airships, but the world knew them by another name, Zeppelins. And for nearly 2 years, German commanders were absolutely convinced that night fighting was impossible, that these massive hydrogen-filled giants could roam the British skies with impunity, bombing cities and military installations while British fighters flailed helplessly in the darkness below. They were wrong. This is the story of how British aviators developed the world's first true night fighters, how 3 inventors created ammunition that could set the sky on fire, and how the impossible became inevitable on a September night in 1916, when a young pilot named William Leaf Robinson turned a German airship into a falling star. The Zeppelin was the brainchild of Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, a German aristocrat who had watched the world from a balloon during the American Civil War and dreamed of something greater. In 1900, after years of experimentation and near bankruptcy, his first rigid airship rose over Lake Constance in Germany. Unlike simple balloons or pressure airships that relied on gas pressure to maintain their shape, Zeppelin's design featured a rigid aluminum framework covered in fabric with multiple hydrogen-filled gas cells inside. This revolutionary construction allowed for unprecedented size, range, and carrying capacity. By the time war erupted in August 1914, Germany possessed 10 Zeppelins and 3 smaller airships. It was the largest fleet of rigid airships in the world, and German military planners saw them as a decisive strategic weapon. Count Zeppelin himself had envisioned them as scouts for the high seas fleet, observing enemy naval movements from altitudes conventional reconnaissance could never reach. But a young naval officer named Peter Strasser had grander visions. Korvettenkapitän Peter Strasser assumed command of the Naval Airship Division in September 1913, following 2 catastrophic accidents that had claimed both L1 and L2 with almost all hands. Many within the German Navy wanted to abandon the airship program entirely. The machines were expensive, dangerous, and unproven. Strasser saw something different, a weapon that could bypass armies, navies, and fortifications to strike directly at an enemy's industrial capacity and civilian morale. If the lifelong bachelor had a passion, it was airships, and he became their most tireless advocate. In the war's opening months, German Army Zeppelins attempted tactical bombing in daylight over Belgium and France. The results were disastrous. 3 Zeppelins were shot down by ground fire in the first month alone. The massive airships, for all their technological sophistication, proved incredibly vulnerable to rifle and artillery fire from below. Even a single puncture could cause a slow loss of hydrogen, and enough holes would send an airship spiralling to Earth. The German army quickly abandoned daylight airship operations, but Strasser and the German Navy saw an opportunity where the army saw failure. The Zeppelins were vulnerable in daylight, yes, but what if they only attacked at night? In the darkness, ground fire would be largely ineffective. Anti-aircraft guns couldn't hit what they couldn't see, and British fighter aircraft of 1914 and early 1915 were primitive machines with limited climb rates, no navigation instruments for night flying, and no effective method of locating a target in the darkness. The Kaiser hesitated, Wilhelm II had family connections to the British royal family and initially forbade attacks on London, fearing harm to his relatives. But pressure from the military command and frustration with the naval blockade strangling Germany wore down his resistance. On January 7, 1915, he authorised airship attacks on England. Military and industrial targets only, he insisted, though this restriction would prove impossible to enforce in the darkness. The first raid on Great Yarmouth and King's Lynn was a reconnaissance in force, testing British defences and public reaction. What Strasser learned was encouraging from a German perspective. 2 British aircraft managed to take off in response, but neither found the airships in the darkness. Anti-aircraft fire was sporadic and wildly inaccurate. The British seemed almost completely unprepared for aerial attack at night. Over the following months, Zeppelin raids on Britain became increasingly bold and frequent. The airships operated at altitudes between 10,000 and 15,000 feet, heights that early war aircraft struggled to reach. The BE-2C, the primary British fighter available for home defence in 1915, required nearly an hour to climb to 10,000 feet. By the time defenders reached operational altitude, the raiders had usually completed their attacks and disappeared back across the North Sea. The mathematical problem facing British defenders was brutal. A Zeppelin raid might be detected by coastal observers or listening stations picking up radio transmissions. The alarm would reach London or regional headquarters within minutes. Fighters would scramble, engines coughing to life, aircraft bumping across grass fields in the darkness. Then came the climb, painfully slow, the pilot sitting in an open cockpit at 80 miles per hour, temperature dropping a degree for every 300 feet of altitude gained. At 10,000 feet, the temperature would be near freezing. At 15,000 feet, well below zero. And all this in complete darkness, with no horizon, no reference points, only the instruments glowing faintly in the cockpit. If a pilot was lucky enough to reach the Zeppelin's altitude, he still had to find it in hundreds of square miles of night sky. Searchlights helped when they managed to catch and hold a target, but clouds could hide an airship in seconds. Once located, the pilot faced another problem. What weapons could damage something so enormous? Early attempts used the only armament available, carbines and pistols fired by pilots or observers. Some aircraft carried small bombs, attempting to climb above the Zeppelin and drop explosives onto its envelope. On June 6, 1915, Flight Sub-Lieutenant Reginald Warneford of the Royal Naval Air Service achieved what seemed impossible. Flying a Morane Saulnier monoplane, he pursued Zeppelin LS-37 back toward its base in occupied Belgium. After a long chase, he managed to climb above the airship and dropped 6 20-pound bombs. The third bomb struck true, and LS-7 erupted in flames, falling to earth near Ghent. All but one of the 28-man crew died. Warneford received the Victoria Cross, becoming a national hero overnight. The success seemed to prove that Zeppelins could be destroyed, but the method was nearly impossible to replicate. Warneford had succeeded through a combination of exceptional skill, favourable weather, and extraordinary luck. Getting above a Zeppelin in the darkness, then positioning accurately enough to drop bombs on a moving target, required conditions that rarely aligned. Warneford himself died in a flying accident just 10 days later, never having the chance to repeat his victory. Meanwhile, the raids continued and intensified. On May 31, 1915, Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Mathy, commanding the new P-class Zeppelin L9, led the first successful attack on London. Mathy was 33 years old, a brilliant airship commander who had become Germany's most successful raider. His L9 followed the silvery ribbon of the Thames through the darkness, dropping 90 incendiary bombs and 30 grenades across East London. 7 people died, 35 were injured, and psychological impact rippled across Britain. If the capital itself wasn't safe, nowhere was. The public demanded action. Politicians pressed military commanders. Why couldn't the Royal Flying Corps and Royal Naval Air Service stop these raiders? The answer was brutally simple. They had no effective means to do so. Standard rifle-caliber ammunition, the .303 rounds used in aircraft machine guns, created small punctures in a Zeppelin's gas cells. These punctures leaked hydrogen slowly, but not fast enough to bring down an airship during a brief aerial encounter. The hydrogen inside the gas cells was certainly flammable, explosive even, when mixed with oxygen in the right proportions. But the cells were sealed, with little oxygen inside. A bullet passing through created 2 small holes, entrance and exit, allowing hydrogen to leak out but rarely igniting it. Tracer ammunition, rounds that burned brightly to help pilots aim, also failed. The phosphorus in tracer rounds burned outside the gas cells, creating spectacular visual effects but rarely igniting the escaping hydrogen. Frustrated pilots fired entire ammunition drums into Zeppelins and watched them sail away apparently undamaged. By mid-1915, the British defensive situation bordered on hopeless. Zeppelin raids occurred roughly twice per month, attacking cities across England. London was hit repeatedly. The public huddled in basements and underground tube stations, listening to the drone of airship engines overhead and the crash of falling bombs. Civilians began calling the raiders baby killers after several raids killed children. Anti-German sentiment reached fever pitch. German-owned shops were attacked. People with German surnames faced harassment. The psychological pressure was exactly what Strasser had envisioned. A nation's morale could be attacked directly from the air. What changed the equation wasn't a new aircraft or a revolutionary tactic. It was three inventors and the ammunition they created. John Pomeroy was a New Zealander with an exceptional aptitude for technical innovation. As a boy, he had invented a non-slip clothes prop and sold the patent for $50. Later inventions included a painless rabbit trap, improved sheep shears, and pneumatic leg guards for cricket players. In 1902, he designed an explosive bullet, but New Zealand authorities showed no interest. Disappointed, Pomeroy emigrated to Australia and later to England. In August 1914, as war erupted, he submitted his explosive bullet design to the British War Office. Initially rebuffed, he persisted. By 1915, with Zeppelins terrorizing British cities, officials reconsidered. Pomeroy's bullet was a standard .303 caliber round, but hollowed out and filled with 15 grains of dynamite in a copper tube. The theory was elegant. When the bullet fired, the acceleration caused the dynamite to separate inside the tube, with the stabilizing material settling toward the rear and leaving a film of shock-sensitive explosive at the front. When the bullet struck fabric and passed through into a gas cell, the sudden impact would detonate the explosive, creating a much larger hole than a simple bullet. Pomeroy's wife reportedly filled the first 5,000 bullets with dynamite by hand. Wing Commander Frank Brock came from the famous Brock fireworks family. His understanding of pyrotechnics was unmatched. He developed an explosive bullet similar to Pomeroy's, but using potassium chlorate as the explosive charge. The Brock bullet had slightly different characteristics, detonating on impact with fabric or metal and creating spectacular explosive effects. John Buckingham's approach was different. Rather than an explosive, he created a true incendiary bullet filled with yellow phosphorus. The bullet had small holes plugged with solder. When fired, the heat of the gun barrel melted the solder, and the centrifugal force of the bullet's spin pushed phosphorus out through the holes. The bullet would emit a smoke trail visible for up to 1,000 yards, serving as both tracer and incendiary. Yellow phosphorus ignites spontaneously when exposed to air, burning at extremely high temperatures. By mid-1916, all three types of ammunition were in production and available for testing. The theory behind combining them was developed through experimentation and combat experience. A Zeppelin's gas cells contained nearly pure hydrogen in a sealed environment with little oxygen. The gas was flammable, but only when mixed with oxygen. The solution was to use the ammunition in combination, loaded into machine gun drums in a specific pattern. First, Pomeroy explosive rounds would puncture the gas cell and blow large holes in the fabric, allowing hydrogen to escape and mix with atmospheric oxygen. Next, Brock explosive rounds would create additional tiers and provide spark ignition. Finally, Buckingham incendiary rounds would ignite the now volatile hydrogen-oxygen mixture. The result, in theory, would be catastrophic fire. Testing through the summer of 1916 showed promise. Gun ranges demonstrated that the new ammunition could ignite hydrogen-filled targets under controlled conditions. But would it work against an actual Zeppelin in combat conditions? In July 1916, Home Defence responsibility shifted from the Royal Naval Air Service to the Royal Flying Corps. New squadrons formed specifically for home defence. Pilots trained in night flying, practicing takeoffs and landings in darkness, learning to trust their instruments when they had no visual horizon. Airfields installed primitive lighting systems, flares that could be lit to mark runways in emergencies. The defensive network expanded. Listening stations along the coast monitored for radio transmissions from approaching airships. Observers with binoculars scanned the night sky. Telephone lines connected coastal stations to command centres in London. Anti-aircraft batteries positioned around major cities, their crews trained to work in coordination with searchlight operators. By September 1916, a defensive system was in place that gave British fighters their best chance yet. But the system had never been tested against a major raid. That test came on the night of September 2nd, 1916, when the German Navy and Army launched the largest Zeppelin raid of the war. 16 airships departed German bases in the early evening, 4 from the Army and 12 from the Navy. Their target was London. The formation included 2 of the new Super Zeppelins, the R-class airships that were larger, faster and capable of carrying heavier bomb loads than any previous design. Among them was L-31, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Mathy, now Germany's most experienced and successful airship commander. Confidence among the German crews was high. Previous raids had demonstrated that British defences, while improving, remained largely ineffective. The massive formation would overwhelm whatever resistance appeared, drop tons of bombs on London, and return to Germany having dealt a devastating blow to British morale. As the airships crossed the North Sea, British intelligence detected their approach. Radio intercepts picked up transmissions. Coastal observers spotted the massive shapes against the starlit sky. The alarm went out across southeastern England. Take air raid action. Lights snapped on at airfields across the region. Pilots scrambled to their aircraft. Ground crews hand-started engines that coughed and roared to life. One by one, fighters lifted off into the darkness, climbing toward altitudes where they hoped to intercept the raiders. Among the pilots who took off that night was 2nd Lieutenant William Leaf Robinson of 39th Squadron, Royal Flying Corps. Robinson was 21 years old, born in India to British parents. He had attended St Bees School in Cumberland before entering the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. Commissioned in December 1914, he transferred to the Royal Flying Corps in early 1916 and was posted to 39th Squadron at Sutton's Farm Airfield in Essex, a unit specialising in home defence. Robinson took off at 11:08 p.m, flying a B-2C biplane, one of the older fighters still in service. The BE-2C was stable but slow, with a top speed barely exceeding 80 miles per hour. It was the same aircraft type that German pilots on the Western Front mockingly called Fokker fodder, because of how easily they fell to German fighters. But for night flying over England, stability mattered more than speed. Robinson had been assigned to patrol between Sutton's Farm and Joyce Green, waiting for any airships that penetrated toward London. He climbed slowly through the darkness, the engine labouring, altitude gained foot by foot. At 10,000 feet, reached after 53 minutes of climbing, he levelled off and began his patrol. The night was beautifully clear, with scattered clouds below but excellent visibility above. Robinson counted what he thought were 10 sets of flares, lighting different locations below, signal fires showing where searchlights had spotted potential targets. But weather over the North Sea had scattered. The German formation. Strong winds and storms disrupted the carefully planned approach. Some airships turned back with mechanical problems. Others became separated from the main force. By the time they reached England, the 16-airship armada had become clusters of individual raiders, each commander making his own decisions about whether to press on or abort. One airship that pressed forward was SL-11, a new Schutterlance design only commissioned into Army service the previous month. Unlike true Zeppelins built by the Luftschiffbau Zeppelin Company, Schutterlance airships used a wooden framework covered in fabric rather than aluminum. The wooden construction had advantages in certain conditions but also weaknesses. In high humidity, the wood absorbed moisture, becoming heavy and placing strain on glued joints. Peter Strasser, commanding German naval airships, derisively called Schutterlance machines glue potters. SL-11 was commanded by Hauptmann Wilhelm Schramm with a crew of 15. At 650 feet long and filled with over 1,000 cubic feet of hydrogen, it was a formidable weapon. The airship carried several tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs, enough to devastate several city blocks. Schramm approached London from the northeast, flying at approximately 13,000 feet. Below him, searchlight beams swept the darkness. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, dirty white blossoms of flame-tinged smoke marking near misses. Schramm maintained course, steady and confident. He had made it through the outer defences. London lay ahead, its blacked-out streets invisible but unmistakable. At 1:10 a.m, Lieutenant Robinson, still on patrol at 12,000 feet, saw two searchlights converge southeast of Woolwich, their beams forming a pyramid pointing at a dark shape. He immediately turned toward the illuminated target and began climbing, coaxing every foot of altitude from his struggling engine. By the time he reached the area, he had climbed to 12,000 feet, but clouds had gathered, and the searchlights were having difficulty keeping the airship illuminated. Robinson positioned himself below the clouds, waiting for another glimpse of his target. Then the searchlights found it again, and Robinson saw the airship clearly for the first time. It appeared as a long, cigar-shaped shadow against the stars moving steadily northward. Robinson opened his throttle and climbed after it, but the Zeppelin was also climbing, trying to reach safer altitude above the British fighter's effective range. For several minutes, Robinson chased the airship, closing distance slowly while anti-aircraft fire continued to bracket the target. The situation was dangerous for both aircraft and airship. Anti-aircraft shells exploded around them indiscriminately, as likely to hit the British fighter as the German raider. Robinson had to fly through a storm of exploding steel to reach his quarry. At approximately 2:15 a.m, over the town of Cuffley in Hertfordshire, Robinson finally positioned himself, below and behind SL-11. He was close now, perhaps 500 feet below the massive envelope. He could see the airship's full profile, its gondolas hanging beneath the hull, the framework visible through the taut fabric skin. His aircraft was equipped with a Lewis gun loaded with drums of the new ammunition. Pomeroy explosive rounds, Brock explosive rounds, Buckingham incendiary rounds, mixed in the pattern that testing had shown most effective. Robinson opened fire on his first pass, raking the length of the airship's hull. No visible effect. He pulled around for a second pass, attacking from a slightly different angle. Again, his tracers struck home, but the airship continued flying steadily. Robinson positioned for a third attack. This time he decided to concentrate his fire on a single spot rather than spreading it along the length of the hull. He positioned his aircraft directly below and slightly behind the airship's tail section. Then he opened fire and held down the trigger, emptying his entire ammunition drum in one sustained burst. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a small red glow appeared on the airship's envelope. The glow brightened, spreading rapidly. Within seconds, flames raced along the fabric skin, and the interior gas cells ignited in sequence. What followed was visible for miles across the home counties. SL-11 transformed into an enormous torch, orange and yellow flames streaking up its sides, hydrogen igniting in a roar that could be heard on the ground far below. The framework began to collapse, the fabric skin tearing away in burning sheets. The airship tilted nose down and began falling, trailing fire and smoke. Robinson barely escaped the inferno. The intense heat from the burning hydrogen created powerful updrafts and turbulence. He was forced to put his aircraft into a dive, then a spin, corkscrewing away from the falling fireball. The manoeuvre left him disoriented and nauseated, but he was clear. Behind him, SL-11 plummeted to earth, its crew of 16 men having no chance of survival. Zeppelins carried no parachutes. In the few seconds before impact, the crew faced a terrible choice: burn alive in the hydrogen fire or jump to certain death. Several chose to jump. Hauptmann Wilhelm Schramm's body was later found in a field, having left a deep impression where it struck the ground after falling from over 10,000 feet. The burning wreckage of SL-11 crashed in a field behind the Plough Inn at Cuffley. Thousands of people across London and the home counties had watched the spectacle. Searchlight beams had illuminated Robinson's aircraft as he pursued the airship, making the entire engagement visible from the ground. As the Zeppelin descended in flames, crowds came out into the streets. People cheered, sang the national anthem, some even played bagpipes. Church bells rang. After months of helpless fear, watching raiders bomb their cities with impunity, the British public had witnessed a German airship brought down in flames. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Robinson landed at 2:45 a.m., his aircraft undamaged except for a section of wing he had accidentally shot with his own guns during the attack. He was immediately mobbed by ground crew and squadron mates. By the time he woke a few hours later, he had become a national celebrity. Newspapers splashed his photograph across front pages. The date, September 3rd, 1916, became known as Zepp Sunday, as tens of thousands of people travelled to Cuffley to see the wreckage. Parts of the airship were cut away and sold by the Red Cross for charity fundraising, mounted on pieces of card. Just 2 days after the action, Robinson received the Victoria Cross, thought to be the fastest VC ever awarded. On September 9th, he received the medal from King George V at Windsor Castle, with huge crowds of admirers in attendance. He also received over $3,500 in prize money, put up by businessmen for the first person to destroy a Zeppelin over Britain. Robinson used some of the money to purchase a Vauxhall Prince Henry automobile. More importantly, Robinson's combat technique became the template for all future anti-Zeppelin tactics. Approach from below and behind, where the airship's defensive machine guns had limited fields of fire. Concentrate ammunition on a single spot on the envelope rather than spreading fire. Use the mixed ammunition load, allowing the explosive rounds to create holes that let hydrogen escape and mix with oxygen, followed by incendiary rounds to ignite the mixture. Continue firing until ignition occurred, which might take an entire ammunition drum or more. Within 3 weeks, the effectiveness of the new tactics and ammunition was proven beyond doubt. On the night of September 23-24, another major German raid targeted London with 12 airships. Lieutenant Frederick Sowry shot down Zeppelin L-32 using the same technique Robinson had demonstrated. The airship erupted in flames and crashed at Billericay in Essex, killing its entire crew including Oberleutnant Werner Peterson. The same night, Lieutenant Alfred Brandon engaged L-33, another of the new Super Zeppelins. His ammunition set the airship on fire, but not catastrophically. L-33 managed to crash land in a field, its crew surviving and setting fire to the wreckage before being captured. The captured remains of L-33 provided British intelligence with invaluable information about the latest German airship construction techniques. Just 1 week later, on October 1st, 1916, the most significant kill of all occurred. Second Lieutenant Woolston Joseph Tempest, a 25-year-old pilot who had previously served in the infantry before transferring to the Royal Flying Corps, was on patrol in his BE-2C when he spotted searchlights converging on a target. The airship was L-31, the largest and most advanced Zeppelin yet built, commanded by Heinrich Mathy himself. Mathy was approaching London when caught by searchlights over Cheshunt. Realising his danger, he dropped most of his bombs to lighten the ship and began climbing, trying to reach altitude above the fighter's effective range. Anti-aircraft fire followed him, shells bursting close enough to rock the massive airship. Tempest, patrolling at 14,000 feet, spotted the illuminated target 15 miles away. He turned toward it and began climbing, his engine struggling in the thin air. The hand-operated fuel pump in his aircraft malfunctioned, forcing him to pump manually to keep the engine fed. It was exhausting work at high altitude, but Tempest pressed on. He reached L-31 as Mathy was still climbing, now above 15,000 feet. The airship's defensive machine guns opened fire, tracer rounds arcing toward the small British fighter. Tempest ignored the defensive fire and positioned himself beneath the airship's tail. He made his first firing pass, tracers striking the envelope. No effect. He circled and made a second pass, firing again as he passed beneath the massive hull. Still nothing visible. Tempest positioned for a third attack. This time, flying directly under the airship's length, he opened fire and held the trigger down, raking the entire underside with a sustained burst. For several seconds, nothing. Then L-31 shot upward 200 feet as if struck by a hammer. It hung suspended for a moment. Then flames erupted from multiple points along its length. Gas cells exploded in sequence, each detonation feeding the next. Sheets of fabric tore away and were blasted into the night sky. Within seconds, the entire airship had become an incandescent fireball, glowing orange, yellow and white, hissing and roaring as it fell. Tempest barely escaped. The heat was so intense he had to put his aircraft into a nosedive, spinning away from the inferno. The manoeuvre left him sick and disoriented. When he finally spotted the flares marking an airfield, he misjudged his height in fog and crashed on landing, losing his undercarriage and hitting his head on the Lewis gun mount. He was lucky to suffer only a cut and a headache. Landing crashes accounted for many pilot deaths, making night flying doubly dangerous. L-31 crashed at Potter's Bar just north of London. All 19 crew members died, including Heinrich Mathy. The impact of Mathy's death on German airship operations cannot be overstated. He was Germany's most experienced commander, a man who had survived over 15 raids on England and become a symbol of the airship campaign's effectiveness. If Matthey, with all his skill and experience, could not survive the new British tactics, what chance did younger, less experienced commanders have? The psychological shift within the German airship service was immediate. Crews that had operated with confidence and even arrogance now faced each mission with dread. They began calling their airships flame coffins and hydrogen death traps. Some commanders developed what medical officers termed jabbo fever, physical symptoms of stress appearing when ordered to fly missions over England. The statistics supported their fear. In September and October 1916 alone, 5 German airships were shot down over England using the new incendiary ammunition tactics. The loss rate became unsustainable. German airship production could not keep pace with losses, and more critically, experienced commanders were irreplaceable. It took years to train a competent Zeppelin commander, and Germany was losing them faster than new ones could be developed. Peter Strasser remained defiant. He pushed for development of the height climber Zeppelins, new designs capable of operating above 20,000 feet, beyond the effective ceiling of British fighters. These new airships began entering service in 1917, and for a time they restored some margin of safety. But British aircraft development continued. New fighters with better high-altitude performance appeared, and pilots gained experience in extreme altitude operations. The fundamental equation had changed. What German commanders had believed impossible, night fighting, had become not only possible but devastatingly effective. The British had developed the world's first true night fighter system, not just aircraft capable of flying at night, but an integrated defensive network. Coastal observers detected approaching raids and transmitted warnings inland. Regional command centres received these warnings and scrambled fighters from the appropriate airfields. Searchlights worked in coordination, creating pyramids of light that both illuminated targets and guided friendly fighters toward them. Anti-aircraft batteries provided additional fire while also helping mark the raiders' locations, and the fighters themselves carried ammunition specifically designed to exploit the Zeppelin's fundamental vulnerability. Hydrogen was the source of the airship's lifting power, but it was also its fatal weakness. The mathematical reality was brutal. A Zeppelin contained over 1,000 cubic feet of hydrogen. Each cubic foot, when mixed with oxygen and ignited, released approximately 270 BTUs of energy. When a fighter's ammunition breached the gas cells and created the right mixture of hydrogen and oxygen, followed by ignition from incendiary rounds, the result was an explosion of such intensity that escape was impossible. The framework would begin to fail within seconds. The fabric envelope would tear away. The gas cells would detonate in sequence, each explosion feeding the next. Within 30 seconds of initial ignition, a Zeppelin would be transformed from a mighty weapons platform into falling wreckage. By 1917, German airship raids on England had diminished significantly. The height climbers provided some renewed capability, but the strategic effect was minimal compared to earlier raids. Germany was also developing long-range bomber aircraft, Gotha and Giant bombers, that could carry significant bomb loads and operate at altitudes where fighter interception was difficult. These aircraft began taking over the strategic bombing campaign, relegating Zeppelins primarily to naval reconnaissance, their original intended role. The final German airship raid on England occurred on August 5, 1918. Peter Strasser, now a Fregattenkapitän, led the mission personally, flying aboard L-70, the most advanced airship ever built. It was 693 feet long, powered by 7 engines and capable of reaching 81 miles per hour, faster than any previous Zeppelin. Strasser believed L-70 could operate with impunity, its speed and altitude making interception unlikely. He was wrong. 2 British de Havilland DH-4 aircraft, flown by Major Egbert Cadbury, and his observer, Captain Robert Leckie, spotted L-70 over the North Sea and attacked head-on with the explosive and incendiary ammunition that had proven so effective 2 years earlier. L-70 erupted in flames and fell into the sea. All 23 crew members died, including Peter Strasser, the man who had built Germany's airship arm into a strategic weapon and led it through 4 years of war. The loss of Strasser marked the effective end of German military airship operations. Of the 115 Zeppelins built and employed during the war, 53 were destroyed in action and another 24 damaged beyond repair. British defences claimed 77 airships destroyed or disabled, with a significant portion falling to night fighters equipped with incendiary ammunition. The human cost was significant on both sides. German airship crews lost approximately 800 men killed in combat and accidents. British civilian casualties from airship raids totalled 557 killed and 1,358 injured. Material damage was substantial, but not strategically decisive. The raids disrupted civilian life and forced Britain to divert resources to home defence, but they did not significantly impact war production or break civilian morale. What the airship campaign did accomplish was pioneering the future of warfare. It introduced strategic bombing, the concept that an enemy's industrial capacity and civilian morale could be targeted directly from the air. It forced the development of integrated air defence systems, and it necessitated the creation of specialised night fighters, aircraft and tactics designed specifically for combat in darkness. The night fighter techniques developed against Zeppelins would evolve and expand through World War II and beyond. The fundamental principles remained: integrated detection and warning systems to identify approaching raiders, ground-controlled interception to guide fighters toward targets, specialised equipment, whether incendiary ammunition in WWI or radar and guided missiles in later conflicts, to overcome the challenges of night combat, and crews trained specifically for the unique demands of fighting in darkness. William Leifer Robinson's story had a tragic ending. In April 1917, he was posted to France as a flight commander with 48th Squadron, flying the new Bristol F-2 fighter. On his first patrol over German lines, his formation encountered Albatros D-3 fighters from Jaster 11, led by Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron himself. 4 British aircraft were shot down in the engagement. Robinson's aircraft was hit, probably by Vizefeldwebel Sebastian Festner, and he was forced to crash land behind German lines. He was captured, wounded, and not well treated by his captors. Robinson made several escape attempts, all unsuccessful. He was held in solitary confinement at Holzminden prison camp, and his health deteriorated badly. He was finally repatriated on December 14, 1918, 3 days after the armistice. His body had been weakened by imprisonment, and he fell victim to the Spanish influenza pandemic sweeping the world. William Leaf Robinson died on December 31, 1918, just 17 days after returning to England. He was 23 years old. His grave at All Saints Church in Harrow Weald is Grade 2 listed, recognition of his historical significance. Second Lieutenant Woolston Tempest survived the war. He received the Distinguished Service Order for shooting down L-31, recognition second only to the Victoria Cross. He later created a memorial trophy by mounting his photograph on fragments of his aircraft's propeller, alongside pieces recovered from L-31. After the war, he emigrated to Canada, where he had previously farmed before enlisting. He lived quietly until his death in 1966, rarely speaking publicly about his wartime experiences. The technical innovations that made these victories possible extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. John Pomeroy's explosive bullet technology influenced ammunition design for decades. The concept of specialized ammunition for specific targets became standard practice. Frank Brock was less fortunate than the pilots who used his ammunition. He died in April 1918 during the Zeebrugge raid, a Royal Navy operation to block German submarine bases. He was last seen heading toward German positions to set demolition charges and was never seen again. His body was never recovered. He was 47 years old. John Buckingham's incendiary bullet remained in various military inventories through World War II. The principle of phosphorus ignition proved applicable to numerous weapon systems beyond aircraft ammunition. The psychological transformation from September 1916 onward was as significant as the tactical one. German crews that had once considered themselves invulnerable masters of the night sky found themselves hunted. The sound of an aircraft engine in the darkness, once ignorable, became a source of terror. Commanders who had approached England with confidence now approached with dread, knowing that searchlights finding them meant potential death within minutes. The German response revealed their desperation. New Zeppelins incorporated improved fire suppression systems. Gas cells were designed with automatic sealing valves that would close when punctured, attempting to prevent hydrogen leakage. Some airships experimented with filling alternate cells with inert gas rather than hydrogen, hoping to create fire breaks within the envelope. None of these measures proved effective against the concentrated fire of incendiary ammunition. The height climbers that entered service in 1917 were the most sophisticated airships ever built. Capable of operating above 20,000 feet, they pushed the limits of both aeronautical engineering and human endurance. Crews suffered from extreme cold and oxygen deprivation. Frostbite was common. Some men blacked out from hypoxia. The airships themselves operated at the edge of their structural limits, aluminum frameworks stressed by temperature extremes and atmospheric pressure differentials. But even these advanced machines proved vulnerable. British fighters continued improving their high-altitude performance. The C-5A fighter that entered service in 1917 could reach 20,000 feet in acceptable time and had better performance at altitude than earlier types. Pilots learned to operate at extreme heights, using oxygen equipment and developing techniques for high-altitude combat. More significantly, the psychological damage to German airship crews was irreversible. By late 1917, finding volunteers for airship duty became increasingly difficult. Experienced commanders were dead or refused to fly. Replacements lacked the skill and confidence of earlier crews. Morale collapsed across the airship service. Some crews sabotaged their own ships, reporting mechanical failures to avoid missions. Others developed mysterious illnesses before raids. The German Naval Command recognized the problem but had no solution. You cannot order men to overcome primal fear of being burned alive in a hydrogen fire 15,000 feet above enemy territory. The strategic calculus had also shifted. By 1917, Germany faced critical shortages of aluminum, skilled workers, and hydrogen production capacity. Building a single height climber Zeppelin required resources equivalent to building 4 or 5 bomber aircraft. Those bomber aircraft could carry similar bomb loads, were far less vulnerable, and required smaller crews. The bomber aircraft, while initially less capable than airships in range and payload, improved rapidly. The Gotha GV bomber could carry 100 pounds of bombs to London and return. The Zeppelin-Staaken RVI giant bomber could carry over 4,000 pounds. These aircraft operated at altitudes where fighter interception was difficult and were far harder to destroy than hydrogen-filled airships. Even when hit by incendiary ammunition, they didn't explode into fireballs. Economic logic dictated abandoning the airship campaign in favour of heavier-than-air bombers. But Peter Strasser refused to accept this conclusion. For him, airships were not merely weapons, but representations of German technical superiority and national will. Abandoning them would be admitting defeat. He continued pushing for new missions, improved designs, tactical innovations that might restore the Zeppelin's effectiveness. His death aboard L-70 in August 1918 came while personally leading a raid he hoped would demonstrate that airships remained viable weapons. Instead, it demonstrated the opposite. The most advanced Zeppelin ever built, commanded by the most experienced airship officer in the world, lasted only minutes once intercepted by fighters with incendiary ammunition. The contrast between German confidence in January 1915 and the reality of August 1918 could not have been starker. What had seemed an invincible weapon proved fatally vulnerable once defenders developed appropriate countermeasures. The technical lessons extended into World War II. British night fighter development in the late 1930s built directly on WWI experience. The concept of ground-controlled interception, where radar stations detected incoming raiders and directed fighters toward them, was a direct evolution of the searchlight and telephone network from 1916. The specialised night fighter squadrons that defended Britain during the Blitz used tactics descended from those developed against Zeppelins. Even the ammunition used against German bombers in 1940 and 1941 included incendiary rounds designed on principles established by Pomeroy, Brock and Buckingham. The wild incendiary ammunition, which became standard for British fighters in Worth End, used a mix of impact-sensitive explosives and incendiary compounds that would have been familiar to WWI night fighter pilots. The psychological impact of the Zeppelin campaign on British civil defence planning was profound. The experience of being bombed from the air, of civilian populations coming under direct attack, shaped British thinking for 2 decades. When war threatened again in the late 1930s, Britain immediately began planning for mass aerial bombardment of cities. Gas masks were distributed to the entire population. Evacuation plans moved children from cities to rural areas. Underground shelters were constructed. Air raid warning systems were installed across the country. This extensive civil defense preparation, which undoubtedly saved thousands of lives during the Blitz, stemmed directly from lessons learned during the Zeppelin raids of 1915 to 1918. For Germany, the lesson should have been clear. Strategic bombing of enemy cities would provoke the development of increasingly effective defences. The defender's advantage, having shorter distances to travel and fighting over home territory, with support from ground-based systems, would eventually overcome the attacker's initial advantage of surprise and initiative. Yet this lesson was seemingly forgotten, or ignored, by German military planners in World War II. The Luftwaffe's bombing campaign against Britain in 1940 and 1941 followed the same strategic logic as the Zeppelin raids. Attack civilian morale and industrial capacity to force political surrender. The results were similar. Initial success as defences scrambled to adapt, followed by increasing losses as defenders developed effective countermeasures, followed by eventual abandonment of the campaign as losses became unsustainable. The story of the Zeppelin raids and the night fighters that defeated them is ultimately a story about the relationship between offence and defence in warfare. New weapons create temporary advantages that defenders must overcome through innovation and adaptation. The Zeppelin represented a genuine revolution in military capability. For the first time in history, an enemy could bypass all traditional defences, armies, navies, fortifications, and strike directly at a nation's cities and industries. The initial German advantage was overwhelming. British defences in early 1915 were almost completely ineffective. Fighters couldn't reach the raiders' altitude in time. When they did intercept, their weapons couldn't inflict decisive damage. Anti-aircraft fire was wildly inaccurate in darkness. The public was terrified. Politicians demanded action, and military commanders had no good solutions. Yet within 18 months, the balance had completely reversed. Defenders developed specialised aircraft, tactics, and weapons that made airship operations suicidally dangerous. The invincible weapon became a death trap. Attackers who had operated with impunity found themselves hunted and destroyed. The transformation required innovation across multiple domains: technical innovation in ammunition design, tactical innovation in fighter operations, organisational innovation in creating integrated defence networks, training innovation to develop pilots capable of night combat. Each element was necessary, none was sufficient alone. The synchronised combination of all these innovations created the defensive system that defeated the Zeppelin threat. What German commanders thought impossible, effective night fighting, became not merely possible, but routine. The human element was central to this transformation. Men like William Leaf Robinson and Woolston Tempest were not superhuman. They were young pilots, often frightened, always aware that each mission might be their last. Night flying in primitive aircraft was extraordinarily dangerous even without enemy action. Engine failures, navigation errors, weather, and landing accidents killed dozens of pilots. Those who survived long enough to encounter Zeppelins then faced defensive machine gun fire, anti-aircraft shells from their own side, and the constant danger of being caught in the fireball when a Zeppelin exploded. Yet they persisted, climbing night after night into darkness, hunting targets they often couldn't see, firing at massive shapes illuminated briefly by searchlights, hoping their ammunition would ignite before the target disappeared back into clouds or darkness. The courage required for this work deserves recognition. These men were pioneers of night fighting, developing techniques through trial and error, learning from failures that often cost the lives of their friends and squadron mates. For the German airship crews, the experience was different but equally harrowing. They climbed into hydrogen-filled machines knowing that a single spark in the wrong place could incinerate them instantly. They flew for hours over enemy territory, cold, exhausted, watching searchlights probe the darkness, hearing anti-aircraft shells burst nearby, knowing that British fighters were climbing toward them. When searchlights caught them, they knew death might arrive in the next minutes. The only question was whether they would burn or fall. Some crews broke under the strain. Medical records from German airship bases show increasing cases of what we would now recognise as combat stress reaction. Commanders refused to fly. Crews reported sick before missions. Some men simply deserted, preferring court-martial to another raid over England. Peter Strasser tried to maintain morale through personal leadership, flying raids himself, but even his example couldn't overcome the mathematical reality. The probability of surviving multiple raids over England, once very high, had become unacceptably low. The Zeppelin campaign also highlighted the limitations of terror bombing as strategy. German military planners believed that bombing civilian populations would break British morale and force political surrender. They were completely wrong. The raids, if anything, strengthened British resolve. The public united behind the war effort. Workers in munitions factories were more determined, not less, after experiencing air raids. Politicians who might have considered negotiated peace found such positions politically impossible once British cities were being bombed. This pattern would repeat in World War II. German bombing of British cities in the Blitz strengthened rather than weakened civilian morale. Allied bombing of German cities created hatred and determination rather than defeatism. Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor and American cities transformed American public opinion overnight, turning isolationist sentiment into unified support for war. Terror bombing, throughout the 20th century, consistently failed to achieve its strategic objectives. The technical legacy of the Zeppelin campaign extended far beyond night fighting. Airship development pushed boundaries in structural engineering, materials science, aerodynamics, and power plant design. The engines developed for later Zeppelins were among the most powerful and efficient of their era. The structural techniques for building lightweight but strong frameworks influenced aircraft design. The navigation and communication systems developed for long-range airship operations advanced these fields significantly. Hydrogen handling and storage techniques developed for airships found applications in numerous industries. Even after military airships became obsolete, commercial airship travel continued into the 1930s. The Graf Zeppelin and Hindenburg represented the peak of airship development, luxurious transatlantic passenger carriers that seemed to herald a future of airship travel. The Hindenburg, disaster in 1937 when the massive airship burst into flames while landing in New Jersey, killing 36 people, ended that dream. The images of the Hindenburg burning were remarkably similar to those of Zeppelins shot down over England 2 decades earlier. Hydrogen's lifting capacity made airships possible, but its flammability made them ultimately too dangerous for regular passenger service. The irony is that the vulnerability German commanders dismissed in 1915, believing night operations made their airships invincible, proved to be the decisive factor. Hydrogen burns. When mixed with oxygen and ignited, it burns with extraordinary intensity. Creating conditions for that ignition required innovation and courage, but once achieved, the result was inevitable. A Zeppelin, for all its technical sophistication, was ultimately a fabric bag full of flammable gas. No amount of structural reinforcement or defensive armament could change that fundamental reality. When British fighters delivered incendiary ammunition into gas cells, creating hydrogen-oxygen mixtures and igniting them, physics took over. The energy release was catastrophic and unstoppable. The framework would fail, the envelope would tear, the gas cells would detonate in sequence, and the airship would fall as burning wreckage. The mathematical certainty of this outcome, once the tactical problem of interception and ignition was solved, made continued airship operations irrational. The German commanders continued raids through 1917 and into 1918, losing irreplaceable ships and crews, suggests institutional momentum overcoming logical assessment. Peter Strasser's personal commitment to airship warfare may have prolonged the campaign beyond rational military justification. His death finally ended the strategic airship program, but only after Germany had lost ships, crews and resources that could have been better employed elsewhere. The final assessment must acknowledge both the innovation and the futility of the Zeppelin campaign. German engineers created remarkable machines. German crews demonstrated considerable courage. German commanders developed innovative tactics for strategic bombing. But the fundamental concept was flawed. Airships were too vulnerable, too expensive, too slow to build, and too dependent on weather and rare materials. They represented enormous investment for modest military return. The resources consumed by the airship program could have built hundreds of bombers or fighters for conventional operations. Those aircraft would have been more effective, more survivable, and more flexible. The strategic bombing could have been conducted more efficiently with heavier-than-air machines. Germany's decision to persist with airships through 1918 represented sunk cost fallacy on a national scale. Yet the campaign's influence on military aviation was profound and lasting. It forced the development of night fighting, integrated air defense, specialized ammunition, and ground-controlled interception. These innovations shaped aerial warfare for the next century. Modern air defense systems, with their integrated radars, communication networks, specialized interceptors, and advanced munitions, are direct descendants of the system developed to counter Zeppelins. On the morning of September 3, 1916, as tens of thousands of Londoners travelled to Cuffley to see the wreckage of SL-11, they were witnessing more than the destruction of a single airship. They were seeing the defeat of a weapon system and a strategic concept. The age of the military airship had effectively ended, though it would take 2 more years for Germany to fully accept this reality. The night fighters had proven themselves. What had seemed impossible was now routine. The sky, even in darkness, could be defended. German aces who had thought night fighting impossible learned otherwise when their Zeppelins burned. The flames that consumed SL-11 and L-31 and L-70 and dozens of other airships illuminated a new era of warfare, an era where defense could adapt to overcome offense, where innovation could defeat seemingly invincible weapons, where courage and skill combined with effective technology and tactics could prevail against overwhelming odds. The thunder of engines in the darkness, once a sound of terror for British civilians, became a sound of hope. The glow of burning Zeppelins, falling like meteors from the night sky, marked not just military victories but the triumph of innovation over intimidation, of determined defense over seemingly unstoppable offense. And in the end, the lesson was clear. No weapon is invincible, no advantage is permanent. Every offensive capability eventually meets its defensive counter. The Zeppelins came as instruments of terror. They departed as falling torches, lighting the way for all future developments in air defense and night fighting. The men who thought night fighting impossible died in the flames that proved them wrong.